everyone, so here's how I put together Audrey's winter coat for this year. It's made of cotton houndstooth interlined with Amish flannel and lined with Liberty of London. As always, all the materials and timestamps are linked down below. So to get started, I used the Children's Corner Ruthie pattern as a starting off point for the coat. I chose Ruthie since it's designed to open in the front already, but really any bodice pattern would work. You could just add some width to the front section, and I will go over more of that in a little bit. But with all of the pattern pieces, I am going to quilt the houndstooth together with the flannel and the Liberty of London. So I'm cutting out rectangles that are oversized and lining everything up, making sure that all the fabric pieces are flat without any ripples. This quilting idea, along with some other techniques throughout the video, are inspired by how Chanel made her jackets. I'm dabbling in that world and researching as much as I can. I believe that Chanel hand quilted her jackets together, but I'm going to use the machine. And I am not by any means claiming to be an expert in these Chanel techniques. I am simply kind of starting my journey down that road. And if you want to join along on my learning experience down this journey, you are more than welcome. I'd love to have you. To mark where the vertical quilting lines are going to start and stop, I tried using some tailor's chalk, but it really didn't show that well on my fabric. So then I used some sewing pins, and eventually I gave into a heat-activated pin instead. Now going back to Chanel, or really any couture work, they mark everything with thread, but I was not in the mood to go there just yet. That does seem like a delightful thing to do when you have nice big tables to lay everything out nice and flat, but I sew currently in a bit of a shoebox with no big tables to speak of, so a heat activated pin it is. I make sure to start and stop the quilting lines a good ½ inch, if not more, from the raw edges. That way I'm able to machine sew those seams together later on, and I'll show you what I mean when I get there. And yes, quilting these layers together would have been better with a walking foot, but I don't have one of those, so here you go. So moving on from there, I cut out the bodice front pieces once the quilting is done and use those pins to sort of block off the skirt part of the coat, if you will. Add a little bit of room, maybe an inch to each side, that way that has some room to close, to overlap in the front. Now for the skirt, I'm taking some fabric and playing around with it, thinking that I want to put an inverted box pleat on each side of the coat. So I'm just playing around to see how big I want to make the box pleat and where its position should go. Once I get the box pleat pinned in place, then I cut that piece of fabric so it's even with the bodice piece's width. So it's the same width, that's what I'm trying to say. Before I take the pins out that are marking that inverted box pleat, I make little clips so I will be able to put the pleat back together later on. Then I unpin that pleat and lay the houndstooth piece of fabric flat and use it as a pattern for the flannel and the Liberty of London, and rinse and repeat for the other side of the coat. And I put the box pleat back together, including the flannel. These pieces are not quilted together though. So I'm going to take just the flannel and houndstooth layers from the bodice front piece and sew them together with the right sides together with the jacket's bottom front piece. Does that make sense? I'm leaving the Liberty of London, yeah, Henry, I'm leaving the Liberty of London lining pieces out from this seam. And this is why it's important to keep those quilting stitches away from the future seam spots so you still have access to them. Do you need another snack? Next, I'm thinking it would be a good idea to reinforce the houndstooth fabric since it does have a little bit of stretch to it. So I'm putting a strip of silk organza that I had left over from another project. It really doesn't matter the color here though, because it's going to be completely covered once the coat is done. It's just going to provide a little bit of structure to that houndstooth. So I put a line of pins to try to stabilize the houndstooth to the organza before I sew them together. Traditionally and alternatively, you could base the two of these together, hand base them with a needle and thread. Then I sew the organza to the houndstooth on my machine, give that an ironing, and then sew the other side to the houndstooth. And there you go, the houndstooth is now reinforced. So moving on, I take the liberty of London and cut the width so that it was about 2 times as wide as the width of the skirt. And this allows me to gather the top using 2 rows of gathering stitches and then sewing the bottom piece to the top piece of the lining. And in this case, I'm just sewing the Liberty of London pieces together. I'm completely leaving out the houndstooth flannel pieces. So once I pressed those seams open, this was the front of my coat. And one final step before I put this piece aside is that I'm basting the flannel and houndstooth together down that center front of the bottom of the coat. Then I set that piece aside and I move on to the sleeves. I'm just repeating the same quilting steps, again keeping those stitches away from the future seam areas. I'm also adding 2.5 inches to the length of the sleeve. The idea is that you can tuck up the extra into the hem of the sleeve and then just let it out to be able to reuse the coat again next year as your little one grows. And once I finish cutting out the sleeves, then I just put them aside for now. And finally, I cut out the pieces for the back of this coat and I apply the same quilting lines that I've applied to the front bodice pieces and the sleeves. And I went through the same process to cut out the back of the bottom of the coat that I went through on the front of the bottom of the coat. I'm also putting an inverted box pleat in the middle of the back of the coat. Once again, I pulled the lining away so I could sew the back of the coat's bodice to its bottom section, the bottom skirt section. I pressed that seam open and then I took the Liberty of London fabric, again 2 times the width of the back of the coat skirt piece, and then I put the 2 rows of gathering stitches at the top, gathered that area up to fit the back of the bodice, and sewed it to the lining, being careful to leave the outside of the garment as well as the flannel out of the seam. So this step is optional, but I thought it was a really good idea to put some pockets to help protect little hands from the warm weather, and just to store little gloves in there. So I am drafting up a pocket pattern. This is super easy to do. You are just going to create a shape like this. You want a teardrop shape to the pocket, so that bottom right area should look kind of dip down below the length of the pocket, and this dip assures that the items that are placed inside the pocket will stay there, and it just gives a nice comfy feel. Basically, bigger the dip, bigger the pocket, the more stuff you can fit inside, the more roomy, for your hands, all that goodness. Don't be skimpy on the dip. Anywho, I cut out 4 pieces and then sewed it to the side of the coat. I am only sewing through the houndstooth and flannel pieces. I am leaving out the lining from this seam. I am sewing right sides together, then flipping the pocket out and top stitching down it. I give that an ironing and repeat sewing the pockets to the other side of the coat. In order to join the sides of the coat together, I'm starting at the top of the seam, sewing about 1/2 inch below the top of the pocket, turning the coat and sewing atop the cross edge of that pocket, turning down the pocket and sewing like along that dip area, and just kind of sew around it, and then continue to sew down the sides of the coat. Once again, I'm leaving the lining out of the seam. Then I press that seam open as well as press under the raw edges of the lining about 1/2 inch. I'm going to sew these folded edges together by hand later on. So next I join the shoulder seams together, again keeping those lining sections out of the seam. After I sew that seam together, I press that seam open and then I press the lining's raw edges under. And you guessed it, these will be sewn together by hand later on as well. This whole sewing the lining together thing by hand is an idea I'm taking from one of the Chanel's coat that I read about. It allows you to quilt the jacket together first while still keeping the inside of the jacket as pretty as the outside, so there are going to be no raw edges anywhere. At this point, I still need to attach the sleeves and the collar. So I grabbed the sleeves from earlier and I joined them together, only sewing the flannel and the houndstooth pieces together. I pressed that seam open as well as pressing under the raw edges of the lining. I pause on the machine sewing while I hand sew those lining pieces together. I do try to save all my hand sewing at the end whenever possible, but this was a case where I really thought it was good just to get the hand sewing done before moving on. So next I put 2 rows of gather stitches across the top of the sleeve. Well, okay, I'm doing 2 rows of gather stitches through the houndstooth and flannel, like together, and 2 rows through the lining. So I'm doing 4 total. I'm concentrating the gathers around the top of the sleeve. Personally, I just like that look on little ones. And sewing the flannel houndstooth combos together, I'm inserting the sleeve. Once again, I'm pausing to do some hand sewing. I'm going to hand sew the linings together down the sides of the coat as well as the shoulder seams of the coat. Then I'm going to fold over the lining of the sleeve and hand sew that in place too. I've heard this is how it's done in Chanel's jackets as well. And it's kind of one of those things that is not going to be completely perfect. And apparently that's part of the appeal to couture collectors. You can see that a person was actually there to construct the garment, so don't stress about it. Now the final piece to this coat is the collar. I added about 1/2 inch to the collar by putting the fold line about 1/4 inch away from the fold. I figured adding a little bit of length was good. The fabric is a little bit bulkier than what the pattern is designed for, and I think it's just a nice look for the coat. So I cut out 2 collars, and I'm opting not to interface them, but you could definitely interface yours if you wish. I put them right sides together and I sew around the outside perimeter. Take your time around those curves. This can make a big difference with having a nice fluid appearance to that collar. You don't want to rush through it. Next, I turned the collar right sides out and gave it a good pressing. You can use your fingers to press the seam out, or it can be helpful to use one of those little pointer tools to get the job done. Once the collar is all pressed out, then I pin the middle of the collar to the center back of the coat. I am just pinning the collar to that houndstooth flannel layers of the coat, and then I sew around the collar, attaching it to the coat. To finish off that edge, I am going to tuck the raw edges of the collar in first, and then fold the raw edge of the lining down and kind of pin the lining on top of the coat fabrics. I will sew this together by hand, and I like the look the little roll gives to the top of the collar. But before I can sew that down by hand, I'm going to finish the front openings of the coat. First I turn the First I turn the coat layers under and then the lining layer under. And I'm just going to pin those layers in place for now. Next come the buttonholes. And I love using this little tool to position the buttonholes equally. It is a little bit pricey, but it is a tool that you will have and use for all sorts of equally spaced items within sewing. It is definitely worth the investment. And it is linked down below. Anywho, I marked the placement with a heat activated pin, and really quickly I am just basting that coat edge under. I will remove those stitches later on once the buttonholes are all done. So to do the buttonholes on the houndstooth flannel layers, here is a summary of the process I use. I really should do an updated hand sewn buttonhole video with in-depth details, but here is just a summary for now. Of course, you can skip on to the next step by looking at the timestamps down below. So I reduce my stitch length to something tiny, like 1.5 or smaller, and I stitch about 1/8 inch away from the mark line on one side, and I do a few stitches to get to the next length, and again about 1/8 inch away from my mark line on the other side. So those machine stitches will go around the buttonhole like so. And next I fold the fabric in half and give a little entry clip. A buttonhole chisel tool would probably be a cleaner approach to this, but I don't have one of those yet. So anywho, I am going to cut to one end of the buttonhole and then turn my fabric around and cut to the other end of the buttonhole. Then I'm taking some beeswax and using an iron to melt it and then sliding it across those cut edges. Beeswax, oh my goodness, is my new favorite sewing notion. I am obsessed. This beeswax is enclosing the raw edges for the moment so the fraying doesn't get worse while I work the buttonhole, while I handle the fabric before it's wrapped up. Alright, now to the next step. I'm taking some buttonhole silk twist thread. Say that 10 times fast. This stuff though is seriously magical. It's also new to me and I am just loving it. I'm running it over with an iron and then using a straw sort of millimeter needle and begin stitching the buttonhole. I'm starting by bringing my needle up away from the end of the buttonhole in between the two layers of fabric, and this is going to conceal that tail of the thread. Then I put my needle under my fabric and wrap my thread under my needle. I pull tight, and this is one stitch. I continue until I've covered my entire buttonhole. Like I said, I plan on doing an updated video soon, and I will link the original in all of its glory down below for the meantime. It is an oldie but a goodie video of mine. And now for the other buttonhole, since Chanel coats have a double buttonhole sort of system. I am taking a strip of the lining fabric and interfacing it. This is German interfacing that comes pre-cut in a 2-inch wide strip, which yes is too small for my 3-inch wide strip, but that's really not going to be an issue at all here, and it is super convenient having the interfacing in strip form. So I've pinned my lining fabric in place so it does wiggle on me as I mark where to put the buttonhole. I'm making a bound buttonhole for the lining and marking its position on the lining fabric as well as on the strip of fabric. And as I mentioned, I'm doing a bound buttonhole. If you already know how to do these, just jump to the next step using those timestamps in the description box. But otherwise, here is a brief explanation of how to do one. I am hand basting my 2 by 3 inch wide interface piece of fabric to my lining with right sides together. Then I take that to my machine and stitch around the perimeter of the buttonhole using very small stitches. When I get to those tabs, I am careful to count the number of stitches so I can do the same number on both ends. And since my little piece of fabric overhangs my lining, I'm just gonna, trim up that edge and then carefully cut a hole for the button. The straight cut for the buttonhole is going to stop about a 1/4 inch away from those end tabs. And then there will be 2 little angle cuts that will go from the straight cut to those corners. I hope that makes sense, and here is a visual to help clear things up. Next, I push the little piece of fabric towards the back of the lining, like going through the hole of your buttonhole. Then I give that a good pressing. It is better to have a little bit of a roll towards the wrong side of your fabric as opposed to a little bit of a roll towards the right side. It just gives a tidier look. Now the next step may take a few tries, but you really want to be as precise as you can with folding each side of that strip so that it's about halfway filling the hole of your buttonhole, and you want to make each fold as even as possible. Just take your time here. You may want to make these folds, try them a couple different times and then just press the folds into place. So next, I baste the folds together, making sure that everything is still looking nice and even. You want the folds to just touch each other, but you don't want to have to pull them to meet while you are doing the basting, since after you remove those basting threads, they're no longer going to meet. You with me? Finally, I carefully stitch the outside of that buttonhole using very small stitches. I remove the basting threads, and you could tuck in the ends of that little piece of fabric under, but in this case they are not going to be seen, so I'm just going to stop here, and this is what my finished buttonhole looks like. Now we are almost done with this coat. We've got to sew those buttons on and do the hand finishing work around the neckline. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to fold the outside houndstooth under and then the lining over top of that. I'm also bringing my hem up and pinning that into place and then pinning the lining on top of that houndstooth. And I'm doing a similar idea to hem the sleeves too. Finally, the very last step is attaching this flat chain. I will link where I purchased mine off Amazon down below. I'm taking some size 10 pearl cotton and using that to secure the chain in place. This chain is one of the Chanel secrets to keeping the bottom edge of her jackets in place, and it's kind of very even with the floor and all that loveliness. So I read that you should go through every single loop, but I also read that you need to remove the chain before laundering, so I'm just going through every 3rd loop. After all, I am not the House of Chanel. So I simply go through a loop, send my needle back through my 2 layers of houndstooth so my thread is hidden, and move on to the 3rd loop from there. Rinse and repeat until the chain is in place. And if you're curious, as I was curious, here's the difference the chain makes. The chain is on the left side of the coat, but not on the right side yet. It doesn't show up as well in the video as it does in person, but even so, you can see the left side is just a little bit flatter and nicer than the right side. It just lays prettier. I do think it's worth the extra effort and money for a coat or a jacket that you really want to shine. So here's my finished garment. The inside of my neckline, down the center front openings, and around the hem. There are plenty of mistakes made on this coat and many other Chanel techniques to refine and learn more about, but you gotta start somewhere, and I think this particular coat will be darling for our coming winter months. So I hope this video was helpful. If y'all have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below and I will do my best to answer them. And as always, I appreciate y'all for watching and I hope to catch y'all next time.